After the construction of the temple, the masons who had been engaged in it dispersed into Syria, Mesopotamia, Assyria, Chaldea, Babylonia, Media, Persia, Arabia, Africa, Lesser Asia, Greece, and other parts of Europe, where they taught the art to many eminent persons and kings, princes, and potentates became grand masters, each in his own territory. The legend then passes on to Nebuchadnezzar, whom it calls a grand master, and asserts that he received much improvement in masonry from the Jewish captives, whom he brought to Babylon after he had destroyed that city and its temple. Afterwards, Cyrus constituted Zerubbabel the leader of the Jews, who, being released from their captivity, returned to Jerusalem and built the second temple. From Palestine, after the erection of the temple, masonry was carried into Greece, and arrived at its height during the Jewish captivity, and in the time of Thales, Milesius, the philosopher, and his pupil Pythagoras, who was the author of the 47th proposition of Euclid, which is the foundation of all masonry. Pythagoras traveled into Egypt and Babylon and acquired much knowledge from the priests and the magi, which he dispensed in Greece and Italy on his return. Footnote. It was probably this part of the Andersonian legend which gave rise to a similar statement made in the spurious production known as the Leyland manuscript. The legend now speaks parenthetically, as it were, of the progress of masonry in Asia Minor and of the labors of Euclid in Egypt in the reign of Ptolemy Lagus, in the methodical digestion of geometry into a science. It next dwells upon the great improvement of masonry in Greece, whose masons arrived at the same degree of skill and magnificence as their teachers, the Asiatics and Egyptians. From Sicily, from Greece, from Egypt and Asia, masonry was introduced into Rome, which soon became the center of learning and disseminated the knowledge of masonry among the nations which it conquered. The Emperor Augustus became the Grand Master of the Lodge at Rome and established the Augustan style of architecture. During the prosperous condition of the Roman Empire, masonry was carefully propagated to the remotest regions of the world, and a lodge erected in almost every Roman garrison. But upon the declension of the empire, when the Roman garrisons were drawn away from Britain, the Angles and Lower Saxons, who had been invited by the ancient Britons to come over and help them against the Scots and Picts, at length subdued the southern part of England, where masonry had been introduced by the Romans, and the art then fell into decay. When the Anglo-Saxons recovered their freedom in the 8th century, masonry was revived, and at the desire of the Saxon kings, Charles Martel, King of France, sent over several expert craftsmen so that Gothic architecture was again encouraged during the Heptarchy. The many invasions of the Danes caused the destruction of numerous records, but did not, to any great extent, interrupt the work, although the methods introduced by the Roman builders were lost. But when war ceased and peace was proclaimed by the Norman conquest, Gothic Masonry was restored and encouraged by William the Conqueror and his son William Rufus, who built Westminster Hall. And notwithstanding the wars that subsequently occurred and the contentions of the barons, Masonry never ceased to maintain its position in England. In the year 1362, Edward III had an officer called the King's Freemason, or General Surveyor of his buildings, whose name was Henry Vale, and who erected many public buildings. Anderson now repeats the legend of the craft with the story of Ethelstan and his son Edwin, taking it with an evident modification of the language from a record of Freemasons, which he says was written in the reign of Edward IV. This record adds, as he says, that the charges and laws therein contained had been seen and approved by Henry VI. And the lords of his council, who must therefore, to enable them to make such a review, have been incorporated with the Freemasons. In consequence of this, the act passed by Parliament when the king was in his infancy, forbidding the yearly congregations of Masons in their general assemblies, was never enforced after the king had arrived at manhood and had perused the regulations contained in that old record. The kings of Scotland also encouraged Masonry from the earliest times down to the union of the crowns, and granted to the Scottish Masons the prerogative of having a fixed Grand Master and Grand Warden. Footnote. From this it appears that Anderson was acquainted with the claim of the St. Clairs of Roslin to the hereditary Grand Mastership of Scotland, a point that has recently been disputed. Queen Elizabeth discouraged Masonry and neglected it during her whole reign. She sent a commission to York to break up the annual assembly, but the members of the commission, having been admitted into the lodge, made so favorable a report to the Queen of the fraternity that she no longer opposed the Masons, but tolerated them, although she gave them no encouragement. Her successor, James I, was, however, the patron of Masonry, and greatly revived the art and restored the Roman architecture, employing Inigo Jones as his architect, under whom was Nicholas Stone as his master mason. Charles I was also a mason and patronized the art, whose successful progress was unhappily diverted by the civil wars and the death of the king. After the restoration of the royal family, Masonry was again revived by Charles II, who was a great encourager of the craftsmen, and hence is supposed to have been a Freemason. In the reign of James II, Masonry not being duly cultivated, the London lodges much dwindled into ignorance. But on the accession of William, that monarch, who by most is reckoned as a Freemason, greatly revived the art and showed himself a patron of Masonry. His good example was followed by Queen Anne, who ordered 50 new churches to be erected in London and its suburbs, and also by George I, her successor, with an allusion to the opinion that the religious and military orders of knighthood in the Middle Ages had borrowed many of their solemn usages from the Freemasons. It will be seen hereafter that the Cavalier Ramsay greatly developed this brief allusion of Anderson, and out of it worked his theory of the Templar origin of Freemasonry. The legend here ends. Upon a perusal of this legend, it will be found that it is, in fact, except in the latter portions, which are semi-historical, only a running commentary on the later legend of the craft, embracing all that is said therein and adding other statements, partly derived from history and partly, perhaps, from the author's invention. The second edition of the Constitutions goes more fully over the same ground, but is written in the form rather of a history than of a legend, and a review of it is not, therefore, necessary or appropriate in this part of the present work, which is solely devoted to the legends of the order. In this second edition of Anderson's work, there are undoubtedly many things which will be repudiated by the skeptical student of Masonic history, and many which, if not at once denied, require proof to substantiate them. But with all its errors, this work of Anderson is replete with facts that make it interesting and instructive, and it earns for the author a grateful tribute for his labors in behalf of literature of Masonry at so early a period after its revival.